In our lifetime, the toilet's going to change from a waste collection device to a data collection device.
Daniel Maggs is the CEO of Bisu, a startup based in Tokyo developing a smart urine analyzer designed to make use of the tons of valuable data we flush down the toilet every day. It's able to track multiple biomarkers from a few drops of urine and currently tracks ketosis via both BHB and AcAc. It tracks dietary acid load via pH and hydration status via specific gravity. The team is working on new tests to track electrolytes, protein intake, and exercise-induced oxidative stress, and eventually hormone markers. I sat down with Daniel in his office in Akihabara to learn more about the company and the science of urinalysis.
Why urinalysis?
Right. So urinalysis is obviously not the most glamorous area. Mm-hmm. And I think most of our experience of urinalysis is you have an annual health check. You pee into a cup. You take that to the doctor. It's tested on site. You get your results. But really what a traditional urinalysis is designed to do is to find obvious problems. So for example, if you have glucose in your urine, it's a sign of having very high blood sugar. If you have protein in your urine, it's a sign of having damaged kidneys. Normally those protein molecules can't pass through the kidney. But they're designed to be used with a blood test primarily. So, for example, if you have no protein in your urine, your GFR, which is a measure of the filtration efficiency of your kidneys, may be declining in blood. So just because there is no protein in your urine, it doesn't mean that your kidneys are okay. Likewise, for glucose, for example, you would never want to rely on a urine measurement because the renal threshold at which glucose spills from the blood to the urine varies from person to person. It goes up with age. And when it comes to things like electrolytes, blood values are very tightly controlled, and actually a lot of electrolytes are not primarily contained in the blood, like potassium, magnesium, calcium. So measuring the blood values of those electrolytes is not going to give you an indication of dietary intake. Urine, however, does. So, for example, the ratio of sodium to potassium in urine correlates with the dietary ratio of dietary intake of both. Because there's an interaction between those electrolytes, just testing one or the other is not accurate. But if you test them together, it is. There are also examples, so free testosterone in the blood is a actionable biomarker, but it won't tell you about total production and how it's metabolized. You need a urine test to find that out. So that's called a Dutch test, a dried urine test, and that's something we eventually want to bring into the home. So testing things like testosterone and cortisol in your urine.
Okay, so you're saying that is actually more accurate than a blood test?
I'm saying that the blood test is telling you about the free circulating levels, but the total amount of the production of the hormone and how it's actually metabolized, like how much is aromatized to estrogen, for example, you would need to have a urine test to find that out. So you get a much more comprehensive view. You get some indication from the blood values, but what I'm saying is in this situation for hormone analysis, urine is the gold standard. Blood is still actionable. So, I think often there's the idea that blood is always the gold standard. The answer is, for many things, yes. The real answer is it depends what you want to test. So another example is pH. So the pH of blood is very tightly controlled. If it changed significantly, you would die. But the excess acidity from your diet and also from, for example, lactate from muscles has to be removed from the body. So it's removed through the breath, and it's removed through CO2 and also through the urine. And the pH of urine corresponds to that acid load. That acid load is bad for your kidney function. Our kidneys decline in function from age 30. It accelerates that process. It also affects things like insulin resistance, insulin growth factor secretion, potentially also muscle retention and bone mass. But also there's very interesting research on it, because both forms of acid load have to be buffered, both from the diet and also from the lactate, that can impact on anaerobic exercise performance. So it's useful for people who have kidney conditions. It's useful for athletes, for example. it's also very useful as a proxy of, do I have enough fruit and vegetables generally in my diet to offset the burden on my body that comes from eating primarily animal proteins, also grains and saturated fat. So this is an example where a serious problem would appear from testing the blood value, but in terms of like daily dietary health behaviors and optimizing health, pH is the more useful value. In short, what we're saying is, we're not saying to people, don't test blood, test urine. We're saying this is a missing piece of your health picture. Every day, 7 billion of us flush terabytes of data down the toilet. And our aim is to help you capture that data to improve your health and fitness. In our lifetime, the toilet's going to change from a waste collection device to a data collection device. There are a lot of challenges around that, some very exciting research around that. I would say probably no earlier than 5, maybe 7 years or more, based not just on what we see in terms of the technology you need, but also where the research is going. So really exciting researcher called Professor Mike Snyder at Stanford. He does research into something called Integrative Omics. So over the last 4 or 5 years, lots of excitement about genomic testing, lots of excitement about microbiome testing, not much excitement about omics, but omics is much more promising. So integrative omics is combining genomics with proteomics and metabolomics. Both the blood and the urine contain thousands of protein and metabolite markers, which relate to inflammation, the presence or absence of disease, hormones, and also dietary intake, for example. There are metabolites that correlate with intake of tomatoes, for example. The issue is that not all those biomarkers, for example, are specific to certain foods, and not all, some inflammation markers can be lower grade inflammation or can be indicative of cancer. So what you need to develop is basically signature combinations of biomarkers that indicate a high risk of a particular condition or a certain eating pattern. And that's where the research is kind of developing right now. So we don't have a definitive biomarker set, which is this is what you need to break down your diet in detail. But what is coming out is very, very promising and very, very exciting. So that's the research side. Okay. And then the second...
So you're getting like a group of biomarkers that act as a fingerprint for something or other disease that can be traced. Or is it a fingerprint for the disease or a fingerprint for the lifestyle?
There are both. So when I'm talking about diseases, I'm talking primarily about protein markers, for example, that proteomics would detect. And then for metabolite markers, there are obviously hormone metabolites, for example, but the ones that I think are most of interest are the ones that relate to dietary intake. Like potentially, we could be tracking our nutrition without even entering anything into an app, based simply on the metabolite signature in your urine. That's very exciting. It would be way more accurate, potentially, than what you could record yourself, because it's not just about what you put into your body, it's also how your body is responding to what's going into your body. In the same way, for example, I talked about pH. You cannot back solve the dietary acid load of your diet from your urine pH, because different people have a different capacity to buffer pH. What you can find out is what is the right combination that your body can withstand without placing an unnecessary metabolic load.
What would be some factors that affect your ability to buffer pH? Is that a genetics thing, or is there some other factors?
Yes, you can't calculate what's called the dietary acid load from the pH, because different people have a different capacity to buffer that acidity. And that's affected by things like physical fitness, how much bicarbonate is in the blood, because that's involved in the production of CO2, which is involved in the buffering process, age and sex as well. One thing that also affects is not just physical exercise, as I mentioned. That really affects the load, of course. But then there's interrelation with the diet. Is also ketosis has an effect too, because ketones are by nature acidic as well. So many people who are in ketosis have a highly acidic diet, a diet with a very high acid load. So if you're measuring the ketones at the same time, that also helps with the interpretation of the pH score.
Interesting. I've heard that as a criticism for one of the criticisms for the keto diet is it makes you very acidic. But is there some other, for example, earlier we were talking about insulin's effect on the kidneys and how insulin will encourage them to retain sodium.
Yes.
Could there, let's see, like if your insulin was lower, would that change your body's ability to buffer pH? Like I'm wondering if there's some other factor coming in.
I mean, one thing I say on that is, directly I would say no, but sodium intake is a component of dietary acid load. So foods rich in potassium are alkaline by nature. Foods that are heavy in sodium are more acidic by nature. So if you are in ketosis and you have a lower insulin secretion, generally speaking, you're dropping more sodium from the body, and that will, as a consequence, likely decrease the pH of the urine. So by measuring the biomarkers together, you can make adjustments for that. The point is that all that acid, whether from ketones, from the diet, or otherwise from the diet, or from exercise, has to pass through the kidneys. And that all damages the kidneys. So the less you can have, the better from that perspective. It's not about changing the pH of the blood. It's the strain that the body is having to endure to keep your pH normalized.
Okay.
Yes.
So do you straight up see with more acid load, lower, I guess would you measure that in terms of GFR? You see lower GFR?
Okay, so GFR is about, does an increase in acidity result in a faster deterioration of GFR would be the question.
Yes.
That's what you probably expect to see, but I would defer to the opinion of Linda Frassetto, because she actually deals with patients. So we're more focused on wellness right now, but she would be in a much better position to give a definitive opinion on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dan followed up on this point with Dr. Frassetto, and her response was that the person whose research I cite is Donald Wesson, who showed in rats that acid levels build up in the kidney tissues, and it's presumably this acid buildup which is damaging to the kidney tissues. Acids, which are free protons, are highly chemically reactive, so it would damage the cells. She added 3 papers for reference. If you're interested, check the description for the links. Commenting on why there were no studies on humans, she said, they did renal micropuncture experiments on the animals to study the tissue acid load removed by fluid flow through the kidney tissue. We can't easily do those kinds of studies in people.
I had noticed that one of the markers that you'll test is ketones in urine, and my understanding was that that is sort of an unreliable marker, at least unless you had just entered ketosis, like if you're not too well adapted.
Sure.
But once you become adapted, it's no longer reliable because your body stops releasing as much ketones through the urine.
Sure. So we do test ketones, but we do it in a different way from before. So a conventional urine test strip is testing something called acetoacetate, AcAc. AcAc is broken down by the liver to form BHB, which is what's used for energy in the body. A blood test tests BHB. It's the primary ketone used for energy. And in prolonged ketosis, more and more AcAc is converted to BHB. So in the early stage, they're roughly equal, and then it goes like that, right? Mm-hmm. So the urine test only tests AcAc. It can't test BHB. And it also has a low sensitivity. So the renal threshold for ketones is about 0.1 millimoles per liter. And the conventional AcAc test has a detection limit of 0.5 millimoles per liter. So this has 2 results. One is in very early ketosis, you don't get ketones in urine with a conventional test strip, typically after a day to a couple of days. Then you start seeing ketones, and eventually, once you become adapted to ketosis, those drop off. And what's happening is that AcAc excretion is decreasing and BHB is increasing. What we do is measure both BHB and AcAc for the first time in urine at a high sensitivity, so both at 0.1 millimoles per liter. So what this means is that you can track ketosis very early, and you can keep tracking it later on. Mm-hmm. One thing I've commonly heard is there's a perception that in prolonged ketosis, fewer ketones as a percentage of production are excreted into urine. I haven't seen a paper that confirms that. What I have seen is one that shows actually the opposite. So in prolonged ketosis, I think in the early stages of ketosis, first 2 to 7 days, about 95% of all ketones produced being oxidized, and then decreasing to a steady state of about 83% after 2 to 3 weeks. So we need to do a study this year to generate a larger data set. We've done some internal testing, but the idea is that with a single test, you can get a high quality alternative to a blood test that measures both early and late stage ketosis, and at the same time track your sodium, your potassium, magnesium, your pH, your hydration, all these things to dial in the diet to the best it can be.
Are there some other challenges you'll have run into? Earlier we were talking about how vitamin C could confound certain tests. I don't think Bisu doesn't actually test for those things, but just to give a better picture of some of the challenges in your analysis.
So ascorbic acid is one issue. It's not a major one, but it is in that it interferes with the glucose and red blood cells test on a dipstick. And there are some that can be coated to reduce that interference. Concentration is very important. You should always adjust the sample for concentration. So we do that using creatinine, which is the gold standard for urine testing. The other thing is, the benefit of urine is that with a single test, you get a picture over a period of time. Mm-hmm. So for example, blood glucose is the gold standard for glucose. Blood is the gold standard for glucose, but it's a gold standard at that point in time. And if you want to get the full picture, you need to have CGM on your body throughout the whole day, mm-hmm. right? With urine, if you test first thing in the morning, it typically correlates with the last 2 to 3 days. And if you test in the evening, it correlates strongly with the same day. So, we want to be tracking all these things about our body, but I think it's going to be a long time before we can be having, 5, 10 or more biomarkers being tracked simultaneously in the blood. And even if you can, as I mentioned, there's some that need to be tested in the urine, like electrolytes. Yeah. So this is a way to get, actionable data with a simple test, non-invasively, doing something you already have to do every single day. And most importantly, when you make changes, the biomarkers move in response, by the next day. So you want to have a feedback loop, right? Okay. So one of the issues with microbiome is you have a non-sterile solid. There's a limit to how many times you want to send your crap in the post, right? Yeah. Urine doesn't have those issues. It's a sterile liquid. Mm-hmm. So I would say, generally speaking, there are more opportunities than challenges. If you're doing something in a toilet, then it becomes very complex because you have things like, sample collection, points of contact contamination have to be cleaned. With this device, the chip is self-sealing, so no urine ever enters the device. You never have to clean it. Mm. And it can be used anywhere. So, and then, for more advanced biomarkers, so hormone detection, you need to use electrochemical sensing. It's more expensive. But, we start with something that is actionable and relatively simple and cost effective, and then we go from there. So we have a plan to diet now, portable, toilet-based device, hormone markers, inflammation markers, and then, really the dream would be to be doing things like liquid biopsies at home. Mm. So
what's a liquid biopsy?
Sure. So if you have, say, you're suspected of having cancer, you have a cell biopsy. So if you have, say, prostate cancer or thought to have prostate cancer, they'll put a needle into your prostate, they'll take cells out, they'll test them. And we now have very good quality liquid biopsies based on urine where you're detecting signs of prostate cancer from the urine, which are specific to prostate cancer. At the current stage, I think there are roughly half a dozen biomarkers of prostate cancer in urine. It's not got to the point where the liquid biopsy is replacing the cell biopsy, but what it's doing is minimizing the risk of unnecessary cell biopsies. So medical practitioners typically do not recommend high-frequency testing based on cell biopsies because there's an infection risk. There's a complication risk from doing the testing. So if they can be doing periodic liquid biopsies, and then when things are looking more serious, do a confirmatory cell biopsy, it's better for the patient. So as I explained, we make a way that you can dip this into the stream of urine, catch a few drops, retract it, and then perform the test in a simple, clean way. Mm-hmm. People typically need to, as we all know, consume more sodium in ketosis compared to someone who's not. So a higher ratio of sodium to potassium, but also it's very important for people to consume enough magnesium. In general, many people can be magnesium deficient, and even if your sodium intake is not too high, having low magnesium intake can produce similar symptoms. And one reason for this is that magnesium powers the sodium-potassium pump, which basically affects how the electrolytes move throughout the body and between the cells. That's why it's important that you don't just look at these biomarkers in isolation, but you look at as many together as possible to have as much context to be able to make a bigger judgment. So we're not trying to, replace any lab testing or replace blood testing. That's not the aim, but we're about the data that matters between the time you're seeing your doctor, right? So let's say, for example, your blood pressure score is very important. The ratio between your sodium intake and potassium intake has a direct effect on your blood pressure. More sodium relative to potassium means more water drawn into the extracellular fluid, which includes the blood, which raises the blood pressure. So by tracking the sodium-potassium ratio and then sharing that with your doctor at your next visit, you can get great insights into why your blood pressure has been changing, for example. Mm-hmm. There's one other fallacy as well, which is, I think, we're not interested in detecting diseases, and there's a reason for this. So acute conditions develop very quickly, and they're typically accompanied by a lot of discomfort and pain, right? Chronic conditions develop slowly over a long period of time. Chronic diseases, which are a huge part of healthcare costs, they are self-caused and they're self-treated. Okay. So the patient is ultimately in control of both, their daily health habits, which like eating too much salt, maybe too much fast-absorbing carbohydrate, for example. Mm-hmm. These are all factors that they are in control of. So, if you say, okay, let's do a device that will help detect diabetes early, you're kind of missing the point, right? Okay. What you need to do is provide something that helps people to avoid getting it in the first place.
Okay, great. I really appreciate that y'all are focusing on looking at things in context, right? Because that seems to be where, for example, one of the things I was talking about recently on the channel was the importance of looking at LDL in the context of HDL and triglycerides. Yes. And then, as you mentioned, if you have having problems with sodium and potassium, you need to look at your magnesium.
We're in a multi-device, multi-data world, right? So I think if you just look at something in isolation, it's like if you track blood glucose, that's a fantastic biomarker. But if you have a low glucose diet, but for example, it's very acidic, it's bad for your kidneys, it's bad for your exercise performance. If you have too much sodium, for example, or too little other electrolytes, that's also bad for your blood pressure. So, if I just looked at sodium, for example, I might make a false judgment about your intake, whether it's correct or not, because with sodium, what's important is not so much the absolute amount, but the amount relative to potassium. So if I have the potassium as well and magnesium or even calcium, I get a richer picture. If I just look at pH without knowing if you're in ketosis or not, I might make a misjudgment, for example. Or if I look at biomarkers without seeing the concentration, again, I might understate, for example, or overstate. So for us, we've designed the chip. We're looking at having 8 biomarkers simultaneously, which is a decent number. And then obviously having different sticks with different combinations based on what you're testing. So that shouldn't be an issue. And I think, we'll be having a beta test later this year, aim for Q4. We also encourage people to experiment. And also in the combination, they want to use certain biomarkers as well, and we want to engage people as well. So we reached out primarily to certain biohackers and also to some professional sports teams, but we're also looking more broadly at the same time. So people are very free to get in touch and share their ideas and to try it themselves. So yeah.
If you'd like to know more about Dan, Urinalysis, or the Smart Urine Analyzer, check out bisu.bio, and you can find the Bisu Facebook and Dan's Twitter in the description.